Hello, my name is Yu-Hsi, and today I'm going to present our paper on the privacy risks of compromised trigger action platforms. This is a joint work with my advisor, Hsu-Chun, and other researchers. So first, a trigger action platform is a cloud service that allows users to connect devices via rules in the form of if some trigger happens, then do some action. There are a bunch of such platforms such as IFT, Zapier, Microsoft Power Automate, Stringify, etc. And the market is still growing. One canonical example is IFT, which has 11 millions of users, 50 millions of rules, and it has 1 billion of rules executed on its server per month. Given its popularity, we'll use it as our example across the paper, but do note that our solution can work on most of the platform. Here is an example of the IFT ecosystem. Suppose that a user has two devices, say a Google Home and a BMW car. Each of them will connect to a cloud server that is provided by their vendor, say Google and BMW, so that they can be controlled over internet. Then here comes the IFT that connects to both of the servers and allow user to upload their custom rules. As you can see, in this case, it aggregates the data from different services, and which leads to the question, what if the trigger action platform is malicious or compromised and is curious about your data? So our paper tries to answer this question and to know how bad it is and how can we make it better. Let's take a look at some of the real example of privacy risking rules on IFT. The first one is save your Fitbit sleep logs to a Google spreadsheet. So this leaks your sleep data. And the second is automatically turn your Android device's Wi-Fi on when you get home. And apparently this leaks your location and when you get home. The third one, keep a log every time your hearing aid has a low battery. So this leaks your health condition that allow the if to know that you might have some hearing issues. And we further do a case study using the triggers of it. We crawl the top 500 triggers based on their popularity and manually label the types of leaked information and their sources of leakage. In this graph, we classify 11 categories of information that IFT can learn from your triggers. We also divided them into absolute leak and potential leak. We say it's a potential leak because the data given to the IFT is just too general. For example, it might be a photo, and we cannot be sure whether the photo would contain sensitive information. And we can see that it can learn a wide range of information about you. It can be your activity logs, such as when you enter a room, when you turn on a light, or when you go to sleep, or your communication logs, like email or instant messages, or your financial data, say your purchase history, or even bank account balances. We also classified the sources of leakage. The first is through the data uploaded to it, like the first rule we mentioned earlier. And the second is by observing the presence of a trigger event. For example, in the second rule, it knows you get home when the event is fired. And the third one is by knowing what device a user owned. This is even worse, as if can infer the information immediately after you created the rule. For example, having a hearing aid related rule indicates you may have some hearing issues. Based on the observations, we define the three security goals of our system. The first is data and parameter confidentiality, which would like to hide the parameters of trigger and actions, and also the data associated with each trigger event. And the second is trigger presence confidentiality, that we want to hide the occurrence of a trigger event. And the third is called the device set confidentiality. This is to hide what devices um, are owned by a user. And so we proposed two solutions um, that satisfy uh, all or part of our security goals. And here are the key ideas of how we achieve these goals. For data and parameter confidentiality, as you may expect it, is through encryption. But the key exchange are a little bit tricky, and we will give more details later. And for trigger presence confidentiality, this is the hardest part, as the goal is actually kind of paradoxical. We would like to hide the event occurrence from the platform, but ask it to trigger actions when event happens. So we propose two approaches. One is called obfuscation, that sends fake triggers even when there's no actual event. And the other is anonymization, that let that we will let the platform knows an event happens, but hide the user that is associated with that event. And for device set confidentiality, we break the rule into two parts, the trigger part and action parts, and we store them on the vendor services separately, so that the if server will not know what devices are connected. Okay, so that's going to the details of our proposed solution. So the first one is called Obfuscated Trigger Action Platform, OTAP, and it's based on the idea of trigger obfuscation. Okay, so we first describe how encryption works. Um, so the user will have a shared key with each services, and will create a key for each rule, which is the yellow one on the slides. And when uploading the rules, user encrypt the trigger and action parameters with um, the corresponding key respectively, and the rule specific key, which the yellow key is included as part of the parameters. And when executing, the trigger and action services will receives um, their parameters and can extract them with their own keys. And then as they both got the rule specific keys, um, they can use this shared key to encrypt the trigger data also. Okay. And for trigger obfuscation, what we'll do is that the trigger services will send trigger to the if server in every fixed period. And we have two delivery strategies to determine what trigger to send in each slot. The first one is called guaranteed delivery, which is guaranteed to send out all of the real triggers. And so in each slot, we will pick up the oldest real trigger that is not yet sent. Otherwise, we will just send out a fake trigger. So as you can see on the slides, the red points means a fake trigger, and the green point means a real trigger. So above the line is the trigger that is actually sent out by the services, and below the line is the time where the actual event happens. Okay, and the other one is called the latest only delivery. So in each slot, we send out the newest trigger that is not yet sent. So for example, in the fourth slot, the event 2 and event 3 are both not sent, and we will choose 3 to send because it is the most recent one, and we will just drop event 2. So this approach shortened the delay between the occurrence of event and the actual time it is sent out. So this is useful for some time varying values such as temperature, as we only cares about its latest value. And finally is how we prevent the false actions. So when we send out the false triggers, because if doesn't know whether it's real or not, so it will forward it to the action service anyway. And so we have to attach a binary flag to the trigger data to indicate that it is a fake trigger, so that the action service won't fire a false action. And since the data are end-to-end encrypted between the trigger service and the action service, the platform is not able to know its value, so the privacy is still preserved. Now we talk about anonymous trigger action platform at ATAP, the scheme based on trigger anonymization. So we start with an overview of our protocol. So the user will upload the trigger and action parameters to each server respectively, and will also upload a service name and action ID pair to the trigger service for it to identify which action to execute. And when the trigger occurs, the trigger service sends the trigger data along with service name and action ID to the if server. The if server will use the service name to decide where to forward the trigger data and action ID. And for the for the action service with action ID, it can know the action parameters to use, and with trigger data, it can execute the actual action. And the encryption works as follow. So the same as OTAP, the trigger and action parameters will be encrypted by the keys shared between the user and the vendor service. That's the blue and purple one on the slides. And there will also be a shared key between the user and the platform, which will be used to encrypt the service name, as this information only needs to be known by the if server. And for the trigger data and action ID, we will have the trigger and action service exchange a key on the fly. And it's basically just an EZDH protocol, but um, some modification is and the encryption works as follow. the same as OTAP, the trigger and action parameters will be encrypted by the keys shared between the user and vendor services. That's the blue and purple one on the slides. And there will also be a shared key between the user and the platform, which is the red one. And this key will be used to encrypt the service name, as this information only needs to be known by the user and the if server. And for trigger data and action ID, um, we will have the trigger and action service exchange a key on the fly. And it's basically an ECDH protocol, but you can refer to our paper for more details. Okay. However, there's a problem. That is, since the service name is encrypted by the user, and then when setting up the rule, this means that in every execution, this encrypted service name will remain unchanged. And this makes the if server have the chance to identify the triggers by using this encrypted service name as a key, as an index. So the trigger service needs to re-randomize the ciphertext each time before sending it out. And the challenge is that the key is on the user and not on the trigger service. But fortunately, this can be done by using the homomorphic property of algamo. Uh, so the trigger service can just encrypt a zero value with the public key, and then it can do an addition of the encrypted service name and this zero value. And this will change the ciphertext, but the underlying plaintext remains unchanged. Okay, now we briefly describe why ATAP achieve all the security goals. So we can see that the triggers are anonymized and confidential. That's because the service name, action ID, and trigger data are all encrypted, so they are indistinguishable from random bytes, and they keep changing every time. And the platform learns nothing about the user of the rule being executed. Um, yeah, since that in most cases there will be multiple users sharing a same trigger and action services. So under the assumption that the trigger and action services are used by more than one user, um, the the trigger action platform cannot identify what. Now we briefly describe why ATAP achieve all the security goals. We can see that the triggers are anonymized and confidential. That's because the service name, action ID, and trigger data are all encrypted, so they are indistinguishable from random bytes, and they are keep changing every time. And the platform learns nothing about the user of the rule being executed. Yeah, that's because suppose that there are multiple users that share the same trigger and action services, then the if server cannot distinguish the different rule executions. And also that the platform has no information about what devices are owned by a user, because now the rule is not uploaded to the if server. And we summarize our two proposed solution. So basically, ATAP achieve all three security goals, but with the cost of platform modification. We also run the experiments to evaluate our solution. Here are the setup. We use the rule, if new item added to to-do list contains the word cat, then send an SMS of this item. This contains all the essential elements of a typical rule. a trigger parameter that indicates the trigger condition, and using event data as action parameters. We first evaluate the computational overheads of each scheme. So you can see in the graph that despite network overhead, the result shows that OTAP adds at most 5 millisecond latency, while ATAP adds at most 25 millisecond. And we think both are small compared to network overheads or other delays. And so, and the bottlenecks lies in the algorithm re-randomization for ATAP. We also evaluate the throughput of our scheme. As OTAP sends our fake triggers, the throughput here counts only the requests that send out real triggers. And the tau means the period of sending triggers. To compare with current IFT, we set the period that makes the latency is around 50 minutes. And so the throughput result looks a little bit bad, but there's always trade-off, and the period is configurable based on the use case of the users. So if the, if we would like to have a higher throughput, then we can just set up a longer um, trigger period. And the result of ATAP is better, as we can still have an 87.5% of throughput after some optimization to deal with the algorithm randomization. Okay, conclusion. We are the first to do empirical study on potential privacy exposures to trigger action platform. And we found that current trigger action platforms are susceptible to privacy leakage attacks. And we also showed that a privacy-preserving trigger action platform is possible and can be implemented with trigger obfuscation and trigger anonymization. Yeah, that's all. Thank you so much.